It's working, right? Thanks to Praveen, we found there's a typo in the handout on scope marking on slide 8. No, slide 8. So when I was talking about the specification scope correlation, so the idea is if you have a WH in spec of the matrix clause, you only specify values for the WHs that are in matrix spec. That's a direct question, right? And I said this correlation I want to question when it comes to long distance peerless stances. When you have one WH upstairs and one WH downstairs and you're giving values, that's where, or when you have some structure like scope marking where you have something that could be in a lower clause but you're giving values, it doesn't mean you have to actually give that WH scope in the matrix clause. There could be other ways of interpreting questions that end up giving the result of that. I said, but in the case of, good morning, Srikar. No, I'm kidding. But in the case of simple clauses, this diagnostic is pretty good. That you give values for all and only the WHs in the spec of that simple clause. But even there, we have to be a little bit careful because there are questions like, what did these kids read that can have peerless stances, that look like peerless stances, but you don't have, you're giving values for these kids, but that is not a WH expression, and just because you're giving values for it doesn't mean you need to give it scope at matrix clause level. And the same holds for which books. So if I say which books did these kids read, you can give a pair list. This should not give you a pair list. Which book did these kids read presupposes there's one book that all of them read. Unfortunately, on your slide, that's the example given. So that's a cut and paste kind of error. It should be, so I said, so even though generally I'm not questioning this diagnostic for simple clauses, but there are cases where you give a pair list, but you don't really want to argue for for matrix scope for that particular expression, namely in this case these books. And there were two arguments that Cliffkind, now this was a case of independently coming to the same conclusion. That we came to this conclusion. At that time, there was a view that demonstratives and definites get wide scope. You move them up and then you quantify them into questions. And we argued for this on this basis that when you do that, it should not matter if you have which book. You should still be able to, so which student read which book, you get pair list. In this case, you don't. That was one. The second thing was you need to have a plural, which books, but you can happily give lists that name just one for each person. Whereas if I asked you which books, which student read which books, there's a presupposition that at least a sizable number of them read more than one. And then the third argument against this was that it shows no subject-object asymmetry. So if you have a quantifier and you say, what did everyone buy, you can give a list with different people buying different things. But if you say, who bought everything, then you don't get that pair list. Then you want to name the people such that they went and bought whatever was available for buying. So you get it when the WH is in subject position, not when it is in object position. At least in the basic cases, there's always some places where this correlation fails. But the important thing was that questions with definite plurals don't show that that asymmetry. So what did these kids read? That's fine, that's in object position. But who read these books would also work. You can say A read this and B read that. So generally speaking, this is so the explanation for this was that you're really looking for an individual answer. And if that individual answer happens to have two plural terms, then you might cooperatively give some kind of pairing between them. Okay? And there were other nuances with the pairing that suggested that the pair list answer is derivative on the individual answer, not an independent pair list answer. All of this, I don't expect you to necessarily process, and I know that today's class no one is processing because everyone is thinking about their presentation, but I will still teach. You can think of other things while I teach. Praveen, you have been wanting to say something.
What about the first sentence? What these kids read? Second, okay, I get that second. Third.
You don't get this pair list? What are you all working on? You couldn't get a distributive reading? What did you all buy? You went shopping yesterday, 3 of you? What did you buy? You can say, well, I bought this, she bought that, he bought the other.
From this, one reading is okay. Each student could be reading, some book. But what if there was a collective reading of some sort going on there?
No, collective reading, it doesn't rule out collective readings.
Or are you talking about different, so would you say that the sentence would also talk about, it could be the same book but different copies?
Okay, let's get away from that. It could be different. It really doesn't. That's not.
I can say these kids are reading Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, but they're all reading different copies, right? But if you're eating, what are these kids eating? This one's eating pizza and that one's eating misal pav, whatever. So there you won't have the collective reading. Thank you. The collective reading is not the one that I'm worrying about. This was supposed to be, if I hadn't made the typo, we wouldn't have spent these 10 minutes, right? But it's just, now that I've said it, it follows. See, if you have an answer hood operator, and that answer hood operator says, give me the maximal, there's only a single proposition that I want, and you have the singular plural distinction, with this you'll end up with uniqueness, right? There has to be one book, one thing that everybody is eating. Now, of course, if I say everyone's eating pizza, they could be eating different slices, different instantiations. So, whatever it is, I can't give a pair list, right? But if I say, what dishes are you all eating or something like that, or, anything that allows, where the answer hood operator says, I'll pick out a single proposition, but that single proposition will relate this plurality of children to this plurality of things eaten or things seen, then cooperatively you can give a kind of pairing. Okay, so this was, just fix your typos please, and I'll try to do that to save the next iteration of this. Okay, so I think Avinash said this yesterday, but I'll repeat. The presentations today are 10 minutes long each, right? And try to keep in that time limit. This will mean making hard choices. In my view, it's better to make whatever point you want to make clearly than try to cram everything in. We all know you have been working diligently, you have a lot of material, and they will submit that, right? So it's not like we won't look at what you have and give comments. This is in order for the rest of us to learn, everybody, and you might say, oh, okay, that's not so different then between, two languages that we thought these two languages were very similar, but now there's this. So it's just for us, all of us, to learn from the group presentations, and also for you to practice your abilities of presenting and synthesizing or deciding what to do. it'll be fun to hear someone else talk than just me. So those are the reasons, right? And when will they submit this thing?
Next week we can decide.
Okay, so tomorrow you can enjoy yourself, right? You can. Okay. So in terms of final presentations, there are 4 broad topics that we are covering. Whichever way it ends up, you know, you should be able to have thought about each one of them by the end of this these 2 weeks. The first was simply basic description of how questions are formed in your language, right? Whether you have WH in C2 looking things, whether it's WH in C2 but not quite, there seems to be a preference, you know, however, whatever it turns out to be the case. And then the other thing which maybe I didn't present quite in the way I should have was, if the language allows extraction, then you have island effects. And the idea was to see, first of all, I should have made it more clear that maybe a language doesn't allow extraction. But maybe you came to that conclusion yourself, or it allows something, some kind of displacement that may or may not be extraction. The second part is if it is a WH in C2, we can also talk about islands in terms of covert scope taking. Is it the case that something that is embedded in an island, or sometimes not even an island, actually ends up having matrix scope? It becomes a direct question. So that was, but that's all about describing the basic patterns in your language so that when we look at other things, we know what to do. Then we looked at scope marking. So again, that's, you know, with scope marking, we saw a few different effects. One was, what are the conditions under which we can use a scope marking rather than an extraction structure? And one question that I have in mind is, you don't have to engage with it for the presentation. I'm just saying, okay, so in English you have extraction and you have scope marking. And then you have different felicity or special felicity conditions that are attached to scope marking, right? So that in some contexts you can ask extraction, but you can't ask a scope marking question. What happens in a language that doesn't have extraction and only has scope marking? Is that scope marking does it still have the same felicity conditions? You don't have to worry about, I'm just saying this is an interesting question, that is it when a language has two structures that end up having similar effects, then the language pushes for some functional distinction at the pragmatic level, or, you know. So that's just a general question that what we discover could lead to. So that scope marking, and then the predicates. Is it the case that it can take all predicates that allow for minus WH and plus WH both, or is it restricted to just something that takes only minus WH, only plus, whatever, we don't know, different languages may behave differently. And so that was one thing, negation. So there was a bunch of properties. Again, given the time, I don't think we expect you to do a full-scale study of scope marking, but whatever is feasible and reasonable. So that's the second topic. The third topic that I introduced yesterday that I will continue with today is delinking. And what I tried to introduce yesterday was that in English, when you look at WH expressions, you can think of them as in 3 categories. Well, 4, but the 4th one I said I'm setting aside what N. So which N, which of the N, and who what by itself, right? Monomorphemics. And I gave some diagnostics, some reason for separating out which of the N from which N. In particular, today I'll look at some of the characteristics of what. And again, maybe in Hindi, not that we can't make partitives, right? You can always say, unme se kaun, तुम से कौन ये काम कर सकता है, or something. So it's always, the partitive is there, but structurally it's a little bit different. It doesn't sit as comfortably. It doesn't have the close analog of kaun ladka, kaun sa ladka. At least in my mentally I don't think of them as close correlates as I think of which N and which of the N. But I don't know how it plays out. Like I said, I haven't looked at delinking in Hindi at all. So it could be, we might discover something in this process. And related to that today, I'm going to talk about, okay, first we classify delinking, non-delinking, whatever, and then we look at one use that Pisetsky has made and that many people have used since then, that delinking allows extraordinary wide scope, okay? Scope out of islands at LF. First of all, there is no real clear explanation why that should be. But I also want to question, is it really the case? And if that's not the case, how do we get this effect of wide scope? So that will, I promise you I'll try to wrap that up by 11, or if we end up not completely ending it by tea time, within 15 minutes after tea time, okay? So we have lots of time then left for you to prepare for your presentation. And the presentations will start after lunch, right? That's the idea. Okay. So that's the third topic. And then the fourth topic, which I'll discuss, which I'll start on Monday and Tuesday, is something we've been, I think you all seem familiar with it, which is this use of particles that are specific to yes-no questions. So polar care. And in that context, I'll first discuss, remember there's two little pieces at the end of the handout on the left periphery that I haven't touched upon, which is Gunloksen and Krivka. And both of them provide a way of thinking about the pragmatics of discourse that builds on Stolniker. So we looked at Stolniker, we have a basic idea of common ground and context set. They build on that in slightly different ways, but that will give us a framework for looking at polar care. And one of the things that's also very interesting in that context is this classification of ask and tell as taking plus WH, and know and remember, etc., as taking plus as well as minus WH. So sometimes they're called resolutive versus in question rogative. So I use Lahiri's terms, which is rogative for ask and wonder, and responsive for things like remember and know. And we look at whether how they separate out in terms of whether they both take speech act phrase or not. So we look a little bit at that, and in an interesting way that will feed into the discussion of polar care. So that's the plan for next week. So this week mostly on WH, next week mostly on yes/no questions, right? Any questions about the plan? Seems okay, reasonable? All right. Okay, so we are done with scope marking. Let us put that away and go to the delinking handout that I gave out yesterday. Yeah.
So you said who, what, and all were monomorphisms, right? But say in Hindi and I guess most South Asian languages, it's not monomorphism because you have yahan, wahan, kahan. So you can analyze it as a WH plus where, human or place or time or whatever.
Wait, not yahan, right? Yahan is the query.
No, like when you say kahan is for where,
Uh-huh.
so the same thing for here, there, and where, or like who, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not in Hindi, but in Telugu you can see this. That you have a WH morpheme and then you have a human morpheme or a place morpheme.
Uh-huh.
Or time morpheme.
Yeah, yeah.
So, do we analyze that as which N or?
Okay, yeah. So that's a good question, and with a not very simple answer. You can also ask that for English, like maybe it's impoverished, but you could say one way to ask that question is, okay, so you have a DP and you have a D, which can be either which or let's say who. In the case of which, you have on this side, let's say NP, so you say which book, which book, which man, and if you have what and who, is it that there is an NP here which is some kind of a null with just features, right, plus animate or minus animate, something like that, sorry, minus or plus animate, but it's there. So then do you say where does, see, this is part of this issue of how do we define delinking. This brings it very close, right, the difference between the two. So then people say, okay, this one can take the partitive, this one cannot. That's one option to say, but why can't it take partitive? I haven't seen a good. The other possibility is that this is not there at all. What you have for this, for who and what, is simply an intransitive DP, which is D, and then, you know, what, who, but this determiner itself has this plus minus element or whatever other features, you know, a language might have gender, etc., such that when you quantify, that's built into the presupposition of the domain, right? So you only quantify over x's that have the property, whose properties match the feature human, human or animate at least, in etc., right? So as far as the both are possible. This brings it closer to it. So one could argue, is it that, so remember, this is a la Pesetsky, that in certain contexts, if you give enough contextual specification, then who and what become delinked. I've kind of argued against it, but I'm saying, you know, if that were the case, you could say that when it's not delinked, or it's not in a context where you have this structure, you have an intransitive structure. And in contexts where you kind of flesh it out, maybe what you have is this, but then the discourse gives it its value. So these are possibilities, you know, logically it's possible, but I'm not sure that there's a compelling argument based on what I've seen. There is one place, I don't want to go into it, I'll just point you to, I kind of ended up taking the position that these are like this based on something to do with mention some answers. So it's there in chapter 3, where, you know, when you give those answers where you know that there are, where can I get coffee? There are many cafeterias, and, you know, they're not, one is not any closer or more convenient, or so you could name all 4 or 5 that you have around here. But you might just say, well, you can get coffee, you know, at the girls' hostel. I don't remember the names of the other. Knowing full well that there are others, but I only want 1 cup of coffee, that will do. They tend not to go so easily with which, but even that is a little bit, so there are some subtle differences that which made me think that, it was a suggestion I made, that maybe when you have the monomorphemic, they really are like this. Like with when you have which students or which boys, and you create the right context, which shops can I get coffee in, or which shop can I get a coffee in, you don't get, so I can just say, if I ask, in which cafeteria can I get coffee? It's hard to give or mention some answer. You were more likely to think, oh, there's more than, you're likely to feel like, why am she asking about which shop? There's so many more. So there's some difference there, but an open question. But from the perspective of what I was saying yesterday, I think all of this is up for grabs now, because the one thing we know is that you don't want to say there's such a thing as delinking that has this structure or this meaning, and which N always has that structure, and who and what can have that. So they don't change character. So that, at least that's the way I'm looking at the data that I have now. Okay. Where I was on page 4. So everyone remembers the basic idea was I had these contexts, some had contextually salient set of objects to quantify over, some did not, and things, the only one that seemed to behave exactly like we expected it to behave was which of the n, right? Which n, it seemed to be okay with things that we might know of. So yeah, this is on page, just recapping what we did. And as well as contextually salient objects that were not different, that you could not differentiate on the basis of anything except deixis, right? The one to the left, the one to the right, or that one, this one. Okay, so now I'm going to go to, one second, let me just, yeah. Okay, levels of individuation. So there's these, so you can think about, let's say, food objects, but there's a taxonomy that you can place them under, right? So in terms of classes, subclasses of food. So the one, if you look at, and this has been, people have looked at such structures in a number of different contexts when talking about, linguistically, that such structures are relevant. So I won't go into a lot of those here, but the sluicing literature, I've given some of the references here, as well as free relatives. What does it mean when you say, I'll eat, if whatever is being cooked in the next room, so that's like food, but you say whatever soup is being cooked in the next room, then you want to think about subtypes of soup, etc. And so there's a lot of work on that. But bringing it into this domain, so remember that we said, so one of the hierarchies I give in 14, so you may have food that goes over stew, soup, pie, let's say, and then you can separate pies by classes depending on what fruit goes into them, right? But once you have blueberry pie, you may have different ways of making it, but they are not really, culturally we haven't given them names that separate out a blueberry pie that's made, let's say by putting fresh fruit and baking, or whether, the berries are, I'm making it up, right? You could think about a class of pies that only use whole fruit and a class that uses completely mushed fruit or something. But at what point something becomes a class in its own right is it's somewhat cultural, and so for example, I've looked at these things in complex predicate formation or pseudo incorporation, and something like house buying or even compound formation. So house buying is something that is probably less common than buying a pencil, right? You buy many pencils in your life. But pencil buying doesn't quite qualify as a pseudo incorporation in the same way that house buying does. Why? Well, there's a meaning of the word buy. I'm kind of giving an informal rendering. I think this issue is quite complex, and I think psychologists have weighed in on what is a sortal noun, what is, when we think about things, which level is the most basic. But if you think about it, when you buy a house, there's a whole process, right? Like, there's a whole script that comes with it. You decide what type of house, what your budget is, how much loan you can get, and then you have to apply for this, you have to do this. So house buying is something more than just, it's certainly consistent with having the transfer of an object from one owner or whatever to acquiring something, right, by giving money. It's certainly that, but it also involves a little bit more. There's a whole song and dance around it. Buying a pencil also involves exchange of goods for money, but not much more beyond that. So we already have a verb like buy, we have a noun like pencil, and we are done. We can say what we want to say. It's when you put two things together and they mean something more, that's when we talk about these kinds of special structures, pseudo incorporation or whatever. Another example is to be in case X. So in English, we can say he is in the building. I could say he is in the shop, he is in the hospital, he is in the prison. And all of these things simply say this person is located in that location. But now think about he is in prison. Certainly, chances are he's in that location, right? But does it says something more, right? It means he is the prisoner. Rather than, where's the jailer today? The jailer is in the prison. The jailer is not imprisoned, right? But when you say in prison, then you're really talking of being incarcerated. Or even things like maybe in some dialects where you say he is in hospital as opposed to in the hospital, etc. So when something becomes name-worthy, when something becomes a concept over and above whatever the individual meanings of the individual items are, that plays into this. So for whatever reason, in our way of looking at food items, we don't distinguish between different types of blueberry pies, even though we are totally capable of seeing that they are different, right? One may be baked with a caramel topping or not, whatever. It doesn't matter. We don't give them a different name just based on that. So what we noticed was when someone says, if we are in a context where everything, we already know this is a contestant, he or she baked one of these pies, and we know that the name of these pies, these are all blueberry pies, it's odd to ask, what did you bake, right? Because what is really looking for a name or property. So that's the basic idea. Or did I already give away my punchline? Doesn't matter. I'm trying to finish early today, right? Okay. So what did you bake? What did you bring? When you're talking about objects, once you get down to this level, blueberry pie or whatever is the lowest name word property level, then you cannot, the domain of quantification stops at that level. So one way to think about it is that what quantifies over properties, not over individuals. So let's hold up on that. So you can ask, so this is an interesting one. This is what happens to you when you start looking at. So once I thought about this, then, I commute between Washington, D.C. and New Jersey, and every train has one car that they designate the quiet car. You have it here too, where you can't talk on the cell phone, you can't, so that you can work on it. And there's no such thing as quiet car. Okay. So when you go to the conductor, the quiet car can change which one is designated. If I go to the conductor and I say, what is the quiet car? He'll explain to me, the quiet car is where you can't talk and you can't use your cell phone. But if I ask which is the quiet car, or which car is the quiet car, or which one is the quiet car, he'll say that one, or the one, next to the cafe or whatever. So those are properties that are not name-worthy properties, but they are, there's always a property that's distinguishing one from the other. So it's not that, things get merged. They are distinct, but the distinction is not based on a property that transfers from one world to another. So there are theories about that, but I think that's what's going on with what. When you say, I went shopping and I bought a book, with a book it's still kind of possible to think, I can say, what exactly did you buy? I think I can get away with that because books have names and the names then are distinguishing properties. But if I say I ate a donut, and then you can't ask me, so what did you eat? I just told you I ate a donut. So you don't ask, remember, a question is felicitous in a context where the answer is not already entailed. So of course, you could answer a chocolate donut. So but I have to then ask what type. So the point is this issue is not trivial and not settled in some sense. There's still more to be said. But I think the idea that you're going down up till a certain level and then you have to stop is what's at the heart of this distinction, where you can use what and where you can use which. So that's which really can quantify over individuals that are all the same kind, where you really can't tell, But with human beings, of course, it's very hard for us to think of not having distinguishable properties between one and the other. There's always the name, and the name carries something with it. So, okay, let me just see if I'm covering everything here. Okay, so there's some background literature those of you who are interested can look up. But 16a is what the explanation is, that I bought a book, what did you buy? It's typically if you're quantifying over dress, pen, and book, that's what you're thinking, then you've already given the answer, I bought a book. But perhaps it is possible to go down further to the name level. And so in the sluicing literature, now I'm talking of the animate-inanimate distinction a little bit. So the 17A and B is from the sluicing literature. Joan talked to a phonologist, but I don't know who she talked to. May be possible, certainly improves if you add exactly. So Joan talked to a phonologist, but I don't know who exactly she talked to. And now and then the second one is John bought a book, but I don't know what he bought. That sounds odd. When you add exactly, it becomes better. So I think in that case, exactly is more needed. So what is the semantics of exactly, right? What are the presuppositions of exactly? When I ask a question with exactly, I presuppose that a less specific answer has been given, right? So if I say, I talked to a phonologist, well, we've ruled out a whole number of people. And then I say, but be more specific. Who exactly did you talk to? And then you can say, I talked to Alan Prince. That's a phonologist, right? So that's a specific answer. But there comes a point where there is no more specific answer. If I say to you, I talked to Alan Prince, I don't think you can say, so who exactly did you speak to? That sounds like, didn't you hear what I said? So after we have named someone, we can describe that person. Maybe you don't know Alan Prince, so you can ask me, who is that? Conversation doesn't end, but you cannot ask me, who exactly did you talk to? Or you can, if you're in a room, you can say, who is that? So there are ways in which it's not that a name finally identifies a person in a completely unambiguous way, but in terms of this hierarchy, I think after that it's this one or that one or whatever, the name is where it stops. And then there's this, part of the issue, so I'm no longer looking at which versus who. Now I'm looking at what is who and what, how, why do they have this funny behavior where you can't refer to a bunch of pies and say, what did you bake? That's the kind of, that's the focus of what I'm doing right now. And in this context, two people actually, maybe I even mentioned them. Maybe I'll say that it comes later. Anyway, so the point was that in a number of different languages, people have noticed differences between what and who. Even though they're both monomorphemic, even though they both are supposed to be non-delinked but can get delinked. And now looking from this perspective, so I was trying to make sure that everything works with animate and inanimate, right? Remember, I bought a book. Which book did you buy? A Nigerian won the Nobel Prize. Which Nigerian was that, or which Nigerian won the prize? All of them seem good, animate or inanimate. But there are these cases where they differ. So one of my students in an undergraduate seminar that I was teaching last year, he came up with a scenario in 18A. It's very, 18A is a normal one, sorry. So when we think about human beings and you're casting for a play, you don't know the names of the people. You're just looking at people, let's say the characters, a young 15-year-old girl, and you're looking at a number of different, you can say which, and different people have to, choose or whatever. So you can say which actor you're going to vote for, which of these actors are you going to vote for, who are you going to vote for, and maybe we don't know the names, but we can say the one on the, the one who who auditioned second. So the next one is the one that this kid came up with. So he had this lineup of 3 human beings who are clones of each other. So this is, you can think sci-fi or future, whatever you want to think of. And I guess he said all of them are named Francisco. There was this other kid in the class, so he said they all are the same. There's no difference between them. They all have the same name. And now Speaker A can only take one of the clones on this trip to wherever, Galaxy B, I suppose. Anyway, Speaker B asks, which clone will you take on your trip? Or which of the clones will you take on the trip? So this is the closest to the blueberry pie case, right? And he said you can't say who will you take on your trip in this context. And the other 15 or 20 students in the class kind of went with him. That yes, in this context, if you can really get past how we look at each other as very people with distinct properties, then you erase the difference between what and who. So on this way of looking at things, again, I don't know for sure, but if this is the case, on this way of looking at things, the grammar is not making a distinction between who and what. Grammar says, I am good, who or what, as long as I'm operating at one level above the level of just indexical things, right? It's just that with human beings, we always have this, when we say who, and we just have a number of people, they always have properties, and we can use names to think of distinct properties. When we name them, that's what we are doing, in a way that we can kind of do it with books, but not really. Certainly don't do it with, paratha or bread or donut and those kinds of things. We can think of type of things. It's not that conceptually we can't separate them out, but there comes a point where you have to stop, right? So, so this is, okay, so the basic idea is that who and what never become delinked. If delinking entails taking on the semantic pragmatic profile of which N, that they can have contextually salient domains of quantification, the identity of whose members may be part of common ground knowledge is possible and non-controversial. On this latter view, any number of quantifiers are compatible with contextually salient domains. So it's really not anything special about WHs, right? So that's sort of, okay. One more point that I want to make from here before we go to the, oh my God, this is a long handout. Okay, let's see. Now, stepping back, so this is just, any of you who, when you look at your language for delinking, try to see whether it's just, whether we need something, I'm just working from Hindi, whether you need this particle con si ladki, con sa ladka, something equivalent to that, or whether con ladka behaves the way we expect it to, or whether there's even a difference, between those forms. One point that I wanted to make, so now I'm setting that aside. It's the same for what. You can think about whether what and who, anything you want to think about along these lines is, I don't know what you will come up with, but I think these are all areas that haven't been looked at enough. Okay, so this is, what you see here is a way of thinking about possible differences or not, or not. But I want to add one point here about, okay, now application. So so remember I said that when delinking was presented in that paper, there were 2 parts to it. One was the idea that WHs themselves can be classified along these lines. And then the second part was this has consequences for grammar. One consequence that Pesetsky has used to good argued for, and in fact is true, that their superior word order differences matter, and delinking is important to word order differences. If by delinking, in whatever sense he meant it, this idea that you have contextually salient domains. In languages like Hindi, we don't have superiority really clear, at least not in the way that you see it in English. But scrambling has some similar, properties, that you need some kind of discourse connection. So that's a place to look at. But there are other languages that seem to really make a distinction on whether a structure is grammatical or ungrammatical based on whether the form of the noun phrase is delinked in the sense of having a D and full DP structure, or it is monomorphemic, again on this view that a monomorphemic may have the same structure but it has a null N, let's say, or just features, whatever it may be. The interesting thing there, as far as I know from the literature, and I'm sure they would have, I think I've even checked, it's really about the form. You can do things in the discourse, it doesn't change the grammaticality judgment in the way it did in the superiority case. So this is from Romanian 20 on page 6. About which of them have you seen? So this is the clitic case that I mentioned yesterday, that L before you have seen. About which of them him you have seen? So this him is okay if you have which, not okay if you have who. And the same is actually played out in Macedonian, so that's 21a. Which of the books both require this clitic ya? But if you look at 20b, if you have what or what book, so this is a language that has also the what book, now you cannot have ya, okay? And it doesn't matter, this one I know it doesn't matter whether you delink it or not. So somehow her take was that this has to do with partitivity. And again, not entirely clear why, but perhaps the partitive, the definite. So I think she linked it up with the inner definite DP. That won't quite transfer over, and I'm going to not go over this table, partly because I don't have time to tie it back in with what I'm doing, but this was really playing up, to what extent partitivity matters. So just ignore that table. I'm now going to discuss this case of what N that people were bringing up yesterday. So we've looked at which N, who, what, which of the N, and this is the last type, what N. Again, not a lot of work has been done on this. In many papers, for example, if you read Grondek and Stokov or Kartunen, very often they use what N and give the same analysis that you would have for which N. However, there are some differences, and these are just very few that I know of, but basically I think I mentioned yesterday that you can't have, if you have a modal sentence, it's okay to use what N, or certainly better, but not if you have an episodic statement about the here and now. So 23a, what student is doing that? Sounds really odd. Or what student is working on this topic? I think, is that the general sentiment here? But what student would do that? Usually it has a kind of an emphatic rhetorical feel, right? No student would do. What student would do that? But if you think about it, what it really means is what kind of student, right? And that's what the modal kind of adds to it. Except for, this is now something that someone in the audience, when I gave this talk last time, brought up. They said that what students are doing that, what students are working on that topic is somewhat better. And I think I share that judgment, right? I see some nods. So here is a puzzle. So far, we've been saying singular, plural, we all agree singular should quantify over domain of atomic individuals. Plural common noun should quantify over the domain of singular and plural individuals. And now we're even willing to admit that maybe what student is really not about what wants something that is more like type of something like that, right? But in this, the difference between B and C, I think everyone will agree there's some relative difference. So that was a little bit of a puzzle. Anyway, my general line on this has been for some time that really when you have what n, you are saying what kind of n in some form. So the way to look at this at C is how come we can drop the kind of. So what kind of student is doing that is odd because, there's something, okay, I won't try to explain that, but the general approach to that I want to take here is draws on, I think I must have given the reference. I think Heim was the first, Heim 87, and then Barrows 23 also has built on that, which is to say that what is a quantifier over kinds, over something more abstract than ordinary individuals. And in English, it's the plurals that lend themselves to kinds. So what am I talking about here? If I say dinosaurs are extinct, this is a bare plural, right? No definite or indefinite article. And this predicate extinct really doesn't apply to actual individual dinosaurs. Here's another one. Dogs have evolved from wolves. No individual dog has evolved, so it's a species, right? And English bare plurals, this goes back to Carlson. English bare plurals lend themselves to kind predication. English singular terms do not. So if I make this dinosaur is extinct, that's just plain ungrammatical, right? In English, you would have to say the dinosaur. Dog has evolved from wolf sounds a little bit better, but okay. So the point is, there is some difference between singular and plural that in the domain of kinds that is distinct from what we note when we talk about ordinary individuals. And that's where I would go to look at how to, if I really wanted to work on what, and that would be my starting point.
Just something to the algebraic diagram which you have shown.
Yeah, no, so that was only based on ordinary individuals, right? So that doesn't quite tell us why we couldn't have what student is doing that. So I'm saying on that algebraic diagram, the plurals can then be used to talk about kind, at the abstract level.
So
The top
node
yeah.
of the other combination.
Yeah, so the top nodes can be intentionalized in a way that you can refer to the kind. The bottom node cannot be intentionalized in the same way. So yeah, to relate it to the diagram that we had, I think one handout ago on the singular plural, you could think of taking the top node of that and mapping it to the domain of kinds, but not the bottom node. And then you want to say, again, I don't know why that should be, and I don't know that it happens in every language, but English what n seems to be sensitive to that, and that might be a way of explaining this difference between singular and plural. Okay. 10:30, not bad. Okay. So this is as much as I really want to talk about delinking. I hope it's more, you're thinking about delinking in a new way that you had maybe earlier, if you had been thinking about delinking. Now I want to go to one application, okay, and then I will stop. So remember, Pisetsky said we have dealing WH phrases, and they must take scope differently from other things. So we have a normal way of taking scope, which is movement. And movement for him respects I. You can have movement all the way up if you want, but it cannot take, movement cannot cross islands. But then we have these cases of islands where things seem to take scope, and now he will use delinking to explain that. Okay, so he says there's an alternative way that dealing WHs can take scope, but not the regular ones. So I will, maybe I can just go to the next. Yeah, so we won't, there are some details here that we can do without for today. Let's go to the new handout that you got yesterday, which says delinking an extraordinary scope. And I'm sorry I didn't have time to renumber things, but within what is there, I think we should be able to. So this starts with section 2, the WH triangle. Delinking an extraordinary scope, and it's based on chapter 7. You have it handy? Okay. All right. Let me get a sip of water, give you time to absorb all the delinking stuff, ready to switch to scope. Okay. Any questions, by the way? We are rushing, but not that much.
Could this expression be in some way linked with the iota operator when you take the top or?
Yeah. So actually, let me give you the reference to that. There's a pretty influential paper by Kierke in 1998 in Natural Language Semantics, reference to kinds, and the basic idea, he kind of models Carlson's kinds in terms of the iota operator. So function from worlds to whatever is the maximal entity, so iota x, such that x is the instantiation of the kind at that world. So, and it's kind of interesting in that connection that if you think about kind terms in any language of the world that we know of, there's never a special determiner that only applies to kind level terms, right? You either have bare NP, like dinosaurs are extinct, or you have the definite determiner, the dinosaur is extinct. In any language. Some languages use the for both singular and plural, some use only for the singular, not for the plural. Languages like Hindi, Chinese, etc., of course, don't have theirs, so they use their singular for both of them. Interestingly, there's no language that uses there for the plural and there for the singular. So you could, the cross-linguistic variation is really interesting in my view, because there's something that's logically possible if it was just mix and match. So I think there are two very interesting cross-linguistic generalizations there. One is that there is no special determiner for kind reference. You know, we have lots of determiners. Why couldn't we? Yesterday when we were talking about what kind of noun phrases the scope mark can be used for scope marking, we were coming up with any number of them. It wouldn't have been so hard to learn one new determiner. But for many, many languages that we've looked at, that's not the case. The other thing is that you don't get the reverse. Why not, if it was just, okay, random choice for plural or singular, if you have a definite determiner, you can use for one or the other or both. There were 3 possibilities, but only 2 of them are seen in natural language. So it's kind of, I think it's very interesting. Okay, so that's another one of my hobby horses, so don't get me started on that. Bare NPs and determiners. I have to get back to questions. And tea at 11. Okay. So I'm looking at, so this is the example that is that is from Baker 1970, Lee Baker 1970, that has been used, that was the starting off point for this idea that yes, islands matter, but only in overt syntax, not in covert syntax. Okay? Why is that the case? So now we look at 28a. If you had John knows, the base sentence says John knows where Mary bought which book. Okay? So this is English. So we have to do fronting. And if we had John knows, this is the island, where Mary bought which book. So I'm using de-linked, huh? And you move this here. Which book does John know where Mary bought? That's an island violation. It's overt syntax. But now I say, who knows where Mary bought which book? Here's CP, here's C, and this becomes okay. Not overt, okay? So the structure is what we see in, now let us look at this sentence. So the matrix has a who or which, let's make it which student for keeping it. So which student knows where Mary bought which book? This question is ambiguous. On one reading, you answer John. John knows everything, right? On another reading, you take the things that she bought and you distribute, different people know different facts about those books, right? So John knows where Mary bought, I think that was Anna Karenina, and Bill knows where she bought War and Peace. So he had examples of this kind, right? And he said his system was a little bit different, but same idea. Basically, what this means is that in one case, so this is the specification scope correlation. For the first answer, this one just moves locally. It just moves here. And only this and this one moves locally here. So what's in matrix spec? Which student? So that's what you answer, John. So your propositions, the set of propositions will be John knows where Mary bought A. So that is in 29C. So 29A is this LF that I've given. 29B, now we all know our lambdas, right? Lambda P, there exists an X, student X, and blah, 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 everything else after that. And you get these propositions in 29C. Only one of them will be true once we apply the answer operator, and we get the answer John. The other option is that now we have a WH in C2, so no islands. And therefore, we move both of them end up in matrix spec. So that is 30A. Which student, which book, T1 knows where Mary bought, T2, etc., etc. So that is a case where this moves here in violation of this island, across this island. Yeah. So, and this has been argued for another basis by Juan most prominently, but I think there are serious problems with it, and I'm just giving you a few. Some of them, it started initially with Hindi, right? Hindi finite clauses, we don't even have to get to islands. Hindi finite clauses are islands by themselves. So if you look at 33A, Ravi जानता है कि Mary ने क्या खरीदा. that is not a direct question, right? So here we have no islands. Now, whatever be the reason, we don't, now we, those days in the 90s, we thought of it as WHNC2. Well, WHNC2 should be able to move all the way, but it doesn't. Again, doesn't matter. Maybe it's already in spec or what, God knows what's going on there. But anyway, if you look at 33B, कौन जानता है कि मैरी ने कहाँ क्या खरीदा? Now this is like the English sentence. You can either get a single WH specified for corn, or you can get it for corn and kya paired up. And also in Japanese is kind of interesting because this is truly WH and C2. So follow the logic here in 34A. So the difference between Hindi and Japanese is that Japanese finite clauses can stay in the preverbal position. So Hindi is SOV for ordinary DPs and objects and for non-finite clauses. But SVO or SOVXP, whatever, because sometimes you can get the year, but whatever, the finite clause comes at the end. Japanese leaves it in the original, in the position where we expect direct objects. Furthermore, remember Japanese has a Q morpheme. So in 34A, we have a Q morpheme in the embedded clause and a Q morpheme on the matrix clause. The WHs, I have just put in the both WHs, they are both in the embedded clause. So this is exactly like John knows where Mary bought what. And this, according to Nishigaichi, who was arguing against this idea of that WH in C2 can avoid islands, he said, look, here's a case, we have a WH in C2. If it could avoid the island, then we would get the answer, we would be asking, name the object such that, name the book, such that Tanaka knows where she bought it, and the answer would be Pride and Prejudice. That's not the answer. That's not the interpretation you get. The interpretation you get is, does he know? So the Q morphemes can't disappear. They have a, they play a role, but they make the matrix question into a yes/no. And the lower Q binds the two WHs. So does Tanaka know where Mary bought which book? So does he know the whole pairing? What this shows, according to Nishigaichi, what this shows is that this is a, these are WHs that may be in situ, but they still obey islets. And now here's the puzzle, and this, he didn't, I have more stuff from him maybe later depending on the time, but what I was arguing for was this WH triangle, that you need one WH upstairs and two downstairs. And I used his base example, and I changed Tanaka, the name, to which professor. So which professor knows Q morpheme on the matrix, Q morpheme on the embedded, Mary where which book bought. And now this becomes, it becomes possible to give the pair list answer. So one last interesting point here. When you have, this is from Mahajan's dissertation, the equivalent of Mahajan. I don't remember if it's the exact, I think it's close to what he had, but the structure is what he was, he credits David Pisetsky with this example. You keep everything the way it is, but you put in an extra clause in the middle. So 3 level of embedding. Which student believes that John knows where Mary bought which book? And this does not have a pair list reading. Notice this is not an island. We haven't added an island, because which book does Bill believe that John knows Mary bought is good? So, cut a long story short, these are arguments, and there are many others in the field that say you cannot really this movement is not going to work. This is not valid. Okay, fine. We have an argument, let's say, we have an argument saying this has to take local scope. But then what? The problem still remains that you have to explain, so how did we get that ambiguity? How do we get that ambiguity? And that's what I have at the in the second part of on page 2. Remember yesterday we looked at echo questions and higher order questions. That's what we will use to see if we can make sense of the piping analysis. So that's what Nishigaichi had also argued for, that in Japanese what you're getting is piping, and his idea was that complex noun phrases are good, they can be piped in a certain way. WH islands normally cannot be. That's what he had said. Okay, so that was his explanation for why 34A is not good. I will show you, discuss that later. But the places where they're good, what happens? How can you make sense of it? Okay. So remember, if you look at 39A, I don't know, I brought in this thing, I thought I would at least tell you about it. The choice functional analysis, but just think of it as an existential, it really doesn't matter, okay? Existential over individuals. The point is this, if you look at 39A, you have where Mary bought which book. And we know that the C0, if you just have, C0 will interpret, no, sorry. So don't look at the star piece, just CP. And think of where as an ordinary WH. And the D-linked which book as prosodically prominent. So the way we were thinking of echo questions, think about delinking as being able to undergo the same operation. Okay, don't have to, but can. And typically in these structures, there is prosodic prominence on that WH. Okay, so if you just play out that game without worrying about the functions for the moment, what will you get? You will have you will have at the level of CP a set of propositions, right? Mary bought X sub j at border, what else? I don't know, the bookstores are disappearing fast. But anyway, at the Rutgers bookstore, Mary bought X sub j at the railway station or the airport, whatever, right? So different places. And now you have X sub j waiting to get bound from upstairs from the start position. So you will end up with a set of questions, right? Where did she buy Anna Karenina? Where did she buy Emma? Or whatever the books are. So what you end up with is a set of 2, 3, 4 questions. Sitting, okay. So that's here. That is what we have at this point. Here. This is a set of Q1, Q2, etc. Right? Where did she buy this one? Where did she buy that one? And now you have a verb that takes a question and relates it to this individual, whoever might be in the subject position, in terms of its answer. So this person knows the answer to this question, if it was just a simple question. But we don't have a question, we have a set of questions. And here again, I think I draw on Lahiri's work, who had QR of the complement. I'm not going to justify, he had it for things like other phenomena, quantificational variability, but if we do think of it as piping if you want, but the point is, this whole thing can move locally, right? The whole island moves. If the whole island moves, this is the local position that it can move to, right? And now what are you pairing? You're pairing a set of it. So, and notice that you need the who or which student here. When do you go to pairless stanza? When you have 2 WHs. If this was John, it would make no difference. It can QR all it wants. It would still mean John knows the answer to those questions. But when there's another WH here and you have the whole island here, which is a set of questions, now it becomes possible to relate two sets. This is Q1, Q2. These are students John, Mary, etc. And you get a pair list between. Let's say John knows the answer to Q1, Mary knows the answer to Q2. And how do we identify Q1 and Q2? We identify it by naming the books. So she knows the answer. So again, it's possible to give specification for values, specify values for a WH that seems to be sitting in an island by giving the island itself a higher order interpretation. You could say by moving here into the CP star position, that becomes, that's what gets spelled out. There are, of course, issues, and I think I'll see if I can take questions, and then maybe I'll stop, and after tea, maybe just 10 minutes, there are a couple of things I want to point out, because I think I heard in yesterday's discussion that it might be, that I think might be relevant to issues I heard. Again, this is all in chapter 7 of this book that you have all bought, I know, right? You can read, it's in chapter 7, so you don't have to worry about, taking down notes. I also put some of it here. Any questions? Okay, so we can take a break and wait for tea. So, should I just complete it then, what I wanted to do, and then that with tea, and then we can work on presentations? Okay. All right, let's see. So this is simply saying one last thing that I forgot to mention that I think is not irrelevant. Remember this fact at the bottom of section 2.1 on page 1, where when you, no, not there. 1 second. At the end of, at the top of number 35. Remember number 35A, where you lose the careless reading. So I'm saying you take this island, you QR, here's a WH, here's the set of questions, and you get a pair list answer, right? Now what I'm doing is saying this clause has John, and then it is itself embedded under whatever, some verb, believes, right? Who believes that John knows where Mary bought which book? Yeah? Why does this not have a pair list answer? Well, we still have the same problem. Node is looking for a question, but it gets a set of questions. So we can move this, but how far can QR take it? It can only go local. So local means this word, this TP, VP, whatever, here, right? It's not close enough to the WH to pair up with. So it's below, it's not in the same. So pair list answers means you have to be classmates. You can be classmate with a DP that quantifies over individuals, or you can be classmates with an island that quantifies over questions. But what you're doing in piping is really QR, and QR can't take you close enough to do the pair list. So that's the semantic piece of piping. Piping analysis have been proposed by Pisetsky, by Nishigauchi, and more recently cable, all with slightly different ways of capturing this general idea that you don't want non-local scope, okay? But this one is using higher order questions, so that's a particular way of doing it. So what we see here is a generalization of, whether you believe in causal pipe piping or not, pipe piping is a reality. And where do we see it? We see it even in simple questions like, whose book did you read? We always get it, right? So this is on page 3. So going backwards a little bit. But why is this an issue? Because if you interpret it straightforwardly, like without, there are ways to interpret it in, what is in spec? It's this possessive, right? Whose book? So what is the quantifier that you will quantify over? Book or person? You want person, right? Because you want to say there exists an X. Let's see. So these are, so you want the answer to name some person. Whose book? John's or whatever, right? But look at 2A. So this is just setting up the stage, saying pipe piping requires a little work. You can say lambda P, lambda X, lambda Y. You have a person X, and then you say, and Y is a book that, the book that X wrote. Some kind of uniqueness is built in there. And now you can say John read, the propositions of the form, Bill read Y. And so, but then you get the proposition, Bill read War and Peace, Bill read Emma, etc. That's not the question we want, right? Sure, books, but we are really interested in owners or authors or whatever. So that won't work. If we do it 3A, lambda P, there exists an X, there exists a Y, person X and Y is a unique book that that was written by X. And now we say P equals Bill read X. But then we get Bill read Sue, Bill read Mary. That doesn't make sense either, right? So clearly what you want is to, we have fronting. This is English, right? So we know that it is in the beginning of the clause. You basically only want the person whose part there, and you want the rest to reconstruct, right? So you want something like, who Bill read S's book? So you want, in effect, to say, who are take all the persons and plug that in for book of that person. So basically some form of reconstruction is what a lot of people use, and then you could use the same for pipe piping. I don't know, but to me it seems like, advantages of reconstruction, etc. You can read up on that. But the general point that I find a little disturbing is, in languages where you do covert pipe piping, it seems like first you do covert piping, then you do covert reconstruction. I don't know. You have to really believe in reconstruction to go that route. A possessive is a real island in English. There's no way you can, avoid that island. So pipe piping and reconstruction is one way. There are other ways of interpreting the fronted NP in position, the way that I've done with the WH island. I won't go into that now. I just want to point out the data in 10 for you, 10 and 11. So I don't follow Nishigauchi's semantics for pipe piping, but this was his account of pipe piping. So 10A is where there's only one cue, so this is what we looked at, and we get an indirect question reading, right? 10B, so 10A is Tanaka knows. Mary what Q. So I'm looking at page 5 now. And this is an indirect question, not a direct question reading. Then you look at B, Tanaka knows Q matrix. Mary what, and this is only a direct question. So that's fine. And now C, this is the one we had looked at. You have Q in both places, and you put in two WHs. So you could say one WH can be caught by the lower one, the other one by the higher one. And that's not the reading you get. So what was Nishigauchi's conclusion from this is that WH in C2 is island sensitive. Doesn't matter, even if you have one free, it doesn't take wide scope. Then he looked at examples like 11A that involve complex NP. And there the case is a little bit different. So you say U, red, Q, so that's the matrix. And now the embedded clause says who wrote book, meaning the person who wrote book. And the answer is similar to, it's like Hindi, kiski likhi kitab tumne padhi. So who is the person such that you read the book that he, she wrote. And even though this is still in an island, this appears to take wide scope. And so his account basically was the following. You can do the what you get is a complex noun phrase, no doubt, but it's a complex noun phrase with a WH at the edge, and that whole thing moves to, it's like the equivalent, one way or the other, of the English whose book did you read? A book written by whom did you read? Something like that. And the second point was that WH islands don't undergo the same kind of piping. They don't create, which becomes a little hard to push when you have this structure. So on my view, yes, you can create a WH island maybe, but you can't, you can do it with this higher order questions. He doesn't, so if you have two WHs, you can get the higher order question, but unless you have a WH here, which you don't have in this example, 10C, right? 10C, there's only a differential NP there. So it's not that you have a problem QRing or typing the clause. It's just that it cannot populate up in the same way that it can from the complex noun phrase, because it's caught in its lower spec CP. A complex noun phrase. Another way to think about it is complex noun phrases don't have a CP projection where you can interpret the WH. So the whole thing becomes a quantifier that is interpreted in the matrix. In the case of a WH island, there's a place to interpret it, whether CP or CP star, whichever way you do it, and then it depends on what the interaction is. So some complicated stuff, maybe, in terms of creating the right semantics, but I hope you see that there's a general argument here about not going with a simple, not taking the easy way out, which is to say, well, let's just forget about islands, move the WH all the way to the top, and we'll have a pair list answers. Okay, now I will end. Tea or not, no tea. Okay, so let's check it out.
Please pick up two handouts for Monday. For Monday and Tuesday, right? So one from each one.